So we're going to go to that San Francisco Association of Realtor form, and this is the what they call the general information, SF disclosures and advisory. This is actually part 2 of the same form because it's a long form. Previously, we did not complete the form, but I know where we stopped previously, so I'm just going to go to where we stopped previously and continue till we finish. Okay. Now, next thing we need to talk about is item number 28, which is the tenant security deposits. This is just a refresher of what you already learned in your salesperson class. If it's a 2 bedrooms, the maximum deposit, security deposit you can collect is 2 months rent. And if it's a furnished unit, the maximum security deposit you can collect is 3 months rent. And upon the departure of the tenant, which means that when the tenant move out of the unit, you have to return the deposit or account for the security deposit within 21 days. So some of the things that you can deduct from the security deposit will be things like any repairs that you incur because the tenant damaged the property, such as nail holes on the wall, broken door handle, also any cleaning that you have to do that is caused by the tenant. For example, you got crayon on the wall, things like that. You can actually do the cleaning and then subtract it from your security deposit. Now, the way you will prepare the statement to account for the security deposit is not as simple as you think. There may be standard form, there may not be standard form, but whether you're using standard form or not, every single repair item has to be itemized. So not only must you itemize, you also have to attach copies of the receipt for any materials that you purchase if you are doing the repair yourself. But if you hire a contractor or handyman to do the repairs, usually you will get the receipt from the handyman and attach the receipt from the handyman to your statement of account. Okay? If you handle this wrong, there could be penalties. So if, for example, if you don't attach receipt and you deduct a certain thing for repair, and tenant is not happy about it, tenant goes to court, and you have to explain to the judge why you did not include the receipt. Or if you don't itemize your repairs, you got multiple items, but you lump them together and you don't have any items, that's also not in compliance with the code. So be as detailed as possible. If it's door repair, write down door repair and then write in an amount. If it's cleaning, put down cleaning. If it's anything else, don't lump all the repair together. If it's different kinds of repair, you want to itemize the different kinds of repair. Now, in San Francisco, landlord has to pay simple interest on all security deposits for at least 1 year at a rate determined annually by the rent board and published on their website. So if you collected a security deposit from a tenant in San Francisco, and this is a rent control tenant, whatever security deposit that they pay you, you have to pay simple interest on their security deposit. Whereas if you are in non-rent control, typically you are not required to pay simple interest on the security deposit. Okay? So just be aware of that. Apartment license fees and rent ordinance fees. If you have if you're renting apartment in San Francisco, there is a license fee you have to pay. Okay. If you want to know more about the license fee, you can go to this website, www.sfdbi.org. Okay, that is a place where you can actually get the information on the license fees and ordinance fees. It says here the rent board recovers part of its operating costs through a permit fee charged to landlords for each residential dwelling unit subject to the rent ordinance. This fee is also added to the property tax bill annually. 50% of the fee may be charged to the tenant living in the unit on November 1st of each year, either billed to them or deducted from their security deposit interest. So what you are paying a fee to the rent board for the rent control tenant, and some of these fees you can actually pass through to your tenant. If you want to know how much of it, here they talk about 50% of the fee may be charged to the tenant on November 1st of each year. So you can actually pass through the fee that you charge, that the rent board charges you. 50% of that can be passed through to your tenant. Pass through means the rent board charges you, you turn around and charge the tenant. That's what we call pass through. Okay. And that is in paragraph 29. Okay. Rita, para quan掉. Owner and relative moving, we talked about that last week, so we're not going to cover it this week. That's already mentioned. Okay. Relocation payments and tenant buyout, we already talked about that, so that's not repeated. Alice Act, same thing. We discussed that last week. Not last week, but the week before. Short-term residential rental, it's called Airbnb. Now, I think in San Francisco, there is a short-term rental tax of, if I'm not mistaken, is 14%. It could be as much as 14% on short-term rental tax. Okay, keep that in mind if you wanted to run Airbnb. Seller occupancy after close of escrow. Now, this one here, you know, sometimes the seller might be needing to rent back because the seller is looking for and buying another house. And because of timing, the seller may have to stay back in the house for some time. Now, when the seller have to stay back for some time, you probably should decide whether it's going to be less than 30 days or 30 days or more. If it's a 30 days or more, seller becomes a tenant. If it's less than 30 days, seller does not become a tenant. The difference between the two is that when seller becomes a tenant, seller will have all kinds of rights that a tenant will have within the city of San Francisco. So you have to be very careful about that. Okay. Now, you know, when the seller is a tenant in a property that has been sold, there may be some issues that you don't want to deal with. So if possible, don't go beyond 29 days. Okay, maximum is 29 days. But sometimes you can't help it. But if you can't help it, then give him more than 29 days. Condominium conversion, I think we may have talked about that previously, but I'm just going to quickly review it. In San Francisco, if you have like an apartment complex, sometimes it is desirable to convert an apartment complex into a condominium. People convert apartment complexes into condominium to escape rent control. The law says once your apartment complex has successfully converted into a condominium project, there is no longer any rent control. You can get rid of the tenant, but you must get rid of the tenant within 1 year. If you don't get rid of the tenant within 1 year, you might be putting yourself into trouble. Let's say, for example, if you are the owner of a apartment complex, you converted your complex into condominium. For whatever reason, you chose to keep the tenants there for a while. and you delayed it until 1 year after, uh, until more than 1 year after the conversion is successful. Sometimes there are some nonprofit organizations within the city of San Francisco that might argue that you waive your right to evict these tenants. So what they're going to do is that if you waited more than a year to evict these tenants or to end their tenancy, these tenants, when they receive your future eviction notice, now your future eviction notice is most likely going to be either a 30-day notice or a 60-day notice. If your tenant has been there for more than a year, you're supposed to give a 60-day notice to end the tenancy. But if they're only there for less than a year, 30-day notice will suffice. Now, recently we had that issue in one of my listings in Bernal Heights. The landlord actually allowed the tenant to continue to pay rent at that location for over 5 years. And because it's greater than the 1 year that I spoke about, there is nonprofit tenants' rights organization in the San Francisco area that would argue that we waive our right to end the rent control. So that was a bit scary for my landlord. So if they're ever in that situation, or if you have a customer who's in that situation, advise them to get rid of their tenants before the 1 year expires, or else they might be facing litigation from a nonprofit in the Bay Area. So that's something that you want to avoid. Okay, that's my advice on that one. Now, I don't think you went over TIC. Let me talk to you a little bit about TIC, because TIC is very common in the San Francisco area. If you have a building that has only one deed, but there are multiple units in that building, and you have multiple TICs on the deed. TIC stands for tenants in common. Because housing is so expensive in San Francisco, it is very common for individuals who can't afford to buy the entire unit to himself, or the entire building to himself. So what they do is that they buy TIC interest. So this TIC interest can be put on the MLS. So when you set up the MLS, and if it's in the San Francisco MLS system, you have an option to select TIC if it's only TIC for sale. So if you're selling in San Francisco, sometimes you need to ask, are you selling TICs, or are you selling the entire 100% interest? Because a TIC might be a fraction of 100%. Okay, that's what TIC means. Now it says here, tenants in common is a form of ownership in which all of the owners of the property own undivided interest in the entire property, in percentages set forth in their respective deeds. By agreement, the owners be assigned to one another specific occupancy and other rights. Now, if you have a buyer who's buying a TIC in the Bay Area, there's actually a TIC advisory form that you have to provide to the buyer, because you know what? There are certain disadvantages of buying TIC. So the buyer needs to be made aware of it. Okay? So we'll talk about the TIC advisory form in the future. But today, we'll just talk about the general information. Square footage disclosure, we'll skip this one. This is pretty standard. Basically, this one will, this is intended to advise the buyer that, sometimes there could be discrepancy between what's reported in the county assessor's office and also what's being measured by the appraiser. Okay. Now, in San Francisco, did you know that in San Francisco, you can have a legal bedroom without closet? Yes, you can. You can legalize a bedroom without a closet in the bedroom. All right? So San Francisco is one of the few cities where actually you can have a legal bedroom without a closet in it. But in most places, You can't have a legal bedroom without a closet. Homeowners and neighborhood online sites. We'll skip that one. Affordable housing encumbrances. You know, in San Francisco, there are some low-cost housing. In some of this low-cost housing, whenever you want to sell it, there could be a restriction on the sale for low-cost housing. For example, some low-cost housing project where they have a restriction on when you can sell it. Uh, Within the first certain number of years, they don't allow you to sell it. So you need to be aware of this type of restrictions when it comes to low-cost housing. The purpose for doing that is to prevent people from speculating on low-cost housing. That's why I call it encumbrances, because encumbrance is basically a restriction on title. So if you can't sell the low-cost housing within certain number of years, that becomes an encumbrance. Now it says here, these restrictions typically prohibit a buyer from reselling the property at market price. Instead, such a buyer at the time of resale must comply with various requirements that ensure another qualified low to moderate income person is buying the property, and that person gets the benefit of a controlled below market price. An example of one of these restrictions is reprinted below. So if you're in low-cost housing, perhaps part of the restriction has to do with the fact that you have to find a replacement buyer or replacement owner who himself or herself is also a low-cost income, a low-cost or moderate income buyer. Okay? So this is very educational. Water heater. I don't have to talk about that. Smoke detector. I'm sure we don't need to talk about that. Residential energy and water conservation ordinances. Uh, this is actually common to other places as well, so we're not going to talk about it. Water conservation, same thing. So I won't talk about it. Underground storage tank. This is unique to San Francisco, so I'm going to talk about it. Did you know that if you buy a property in San Francisco, there may be a disclosure? Well, first of all, there have to be an inspection on whether or not you have any underground storage tank. In some of the old buildings in San Francisco, they do have underground storage tank. So that's probably one of the report or inspection that you have to do and report that you have to provide to the buyer. Now let's look at it. It says tanks buried in front of residential properties were used for the storage of oil for steam heat systems beginning in the late 1800s. They can be identified by a number of indicators: a filler cap in the sidewalk, a breather spout attached to an exterior building wall, which allowed air to be displaced from the tank as it was filled, a fire break and closed boiler room in the basement, and sometimes still in place an electrical box on a wall in the boiler room labeled oil burner. The tanks were abandoned when the fuel source was replaced with piped natural gas. So some of these buildings are very, very old. Like in, my listing, it was actually built in 1908. So we actually had to figure out if there's any underground storage tank or not. And our building has no underground storage tank, so we don't have to do any, we don't have to provide any report. But this is as a result of inspection by the inspection company. So certainly, if the building is very old, always be aware to check for underground storage tank if you are selling or buying a property in the San Francisco area. Okay. Unreinforced masonry and soft story building. Some of these buildings in San Francisco are very, very old. So because they are old, chances are maybe the seismic retrofit is not so good. Okay, so they call it the soft story building. When you buy a soft story building, there is risk in the event of an earthquake. So the city of San Francisco requires all soft story buildings to be retrofitted. So if you want to find out if your building is a soft story, just go to this website, http //sfdbi.org/soft story, and find out if your building is a soft story building. If it is a soft story building, it requires certain retrofit. Now, how is a soft story building defined? It is defined as any structure that was constructed or had a permit application for its construction submitted before 1978. As you know, many buildings are built before 1978 in the city of San Francisco, so you may have a soft story building, okay? And if it has never been retrofitted or has never been sold before, then it's possible that there was no retrofit. And it must also have 3 or more stories for it to be considered a soft story building. So if it's like 2 stories tall, maybe it's not a soft story building. Okay? Just be aware of it. I guess the easiest way to find out if your building is soft story, just go to this website to check out. Punch in the address and you'll show whether your building is a soft story building. Okay? Decks and appendages for apartment buildings and residential condo of 3 or more units and hotels. The housing code requires periodic inspection of all building appendages. Defines that all wood and metal decks, balconies, landings, exit corridors, stairway systems, guardrails, handrails, fire escapes, or any parts thereof in weather exposed areas, but not including any interior building areas. Now, this has to do with the common area if it's a condominium. Okay? Now, inspection must be performed by either a licensed general contractor, structural pest control licensee, or licensed professional architect engineer for the purpose of verifying that the exit system, corridor system, balcony, deck, any part is in general safe condition. Okay. Come to think of it, actually my listing, I probably need to have them look into that because I do have some parts of the building that actually fit within this definition because mine it's a 4-unit. And it says property owner shall submit proof of compliance with this section by submitting a mandated affidavit completed and signed by the licensed professional who inspected the building. Okay? Completed affidavits must be submitted to the Housing Inspection Services Division every 5 years. So every 5 years they have to do the inspection whether the property is for sale or not. So if you're listing one such property, you may need to check with your owner if they have the most up-to-date inspection report. And if they do, provide it to the buyer. So I'm going to go back to my seller and ask for this report to find out if they did the inspection or not. My recollection is that they did not do such inspection. So definitely need to confirm that. Trees and vegetation. Okay, in San Francisco, most of the street trees are actually maintained by the city. If they are on the sidewalk, they are in the public domain area. Those trees are city maintained trees. So you cannot remove any of these trees without the city permitted to do so. Okay? See here, you must obtain a permit to either plant or remove a tree. So not just removing, but planting too. Okay? You need to get a permit if it's in the public sidewalk area. Household and hazardous waste. San Francisco, there are three different bins. So you have to divide your household waste into three different bins. One for recycling, one for compost, and one for landfill. Landfill is like anything that doesn't fit within compost or recycling. You know what recycling is. You know what landfill waste is. The only thing you're not sure is just the compost. Okay. Uh, just check the definition on the website. In addition to that, there are several types of hazardous waste that must be handled separately. Batteries are to be placed in a plastic bag and left on top of one of the collection bins. So if you have battery, you can't just dump it into the bins. Cooking oil should be poured into leak-proof containers. So, okay, make sure the container is leak-proof. And delivered to a collection site. So they have a collection site for cooking oil. All medications are accepted at most pharmacies for disposal. Paint can be disposed of at Ecology's hazardous waste collection facility and or many hardware stores in the city. Syringes and needles can be dropped off in the shop's container at most pharmacies in San Francisco. So you know what? If they have they have to use needles or syringes, you know, there's a place to dispose of them. You can't just dump it in the bins. Okay. Same thing with fluorescent light bulbs and tubes. They must be dropped off at the collection site. 1986, San Francisco enacted a law that talks about hazardous waste in soil. So in other words, you can't bury this hazardous waste on your property. Okay? And that's violation of the ordinance. C&D, you know, talks about retaining a qualified lawyer and accountant. It's just an advisory. And then C basically said that, you know, they tend to update the advisory once a year. Okay? So if you want to get the latest advisories, go to this website. It's called www.SFAR-advisories. All right? Now here, I want to talk to you about general information statement regarding tenants' rights, because that's also part of the advisory. I think it's worth talking about since we have a little bit of time. Okay? And I'm always fascinated by the definition of tenant in San Francisco. They have a different definition of tenant than what you and I commonly know tenant to be. Okay? So read the definition. It says here, a tenant is a person entitled by written or oral agreement, subtenancy approved by the landlord or by sufferance to occupy a residential dwelling unit to the exclusion of others. So anybody that is on the property that is approved by the landlord, whether that person has a direct contractual relationship with the landlord, is considered to be a tenant. So in other words, A tenant does not have to be a paying tenant to qualify as a tenant. So if you meet this definition, you are considered to be a tenant. So the definition of tenant is very broad. So anybody who is on that property with the permission of the landlord is a tenant. He doesn't have to pay rent. Now, if you're a tenant, you are entitled to relocation payment in situation where a landlord has to pay relocation to the tenant to occupy the property. So let's say we have four people living on the property. Two of them signed a lease with the landlord. Two of them did not sign any leases with the landlord. They are just boyfriends and girlfriends with the two that signed the lease with the tenant. Now, if you buy this property as a buyer, and one of the grounds for eviction in rent control is owner move-in. If it's owner move-in, you have to pay relocation. And how do you decide who to pay and how much to pay? Will depend on whether they are proper tenants or not. Now, if they were there without the without the landlord's permission, an argument can be made that they are not a tenant. But if they are there with the landlord's knowledge and landlord agree to it, they could be considered a tenant. So when you want to do an owner move-in, you have to consider them and add a relocation expense for that particular person. So in the example that I just gave you, there are 4 tenants because all 4 are there with the permission of the landlord. So when they move out, when you want to move in, now say for example, I'm a seller. I allow 4 persons to live there, but only 2 people on the lease. The other 2 are either probably husband and wife or, domestic partner. We don't know what their relationship is, but they are not on the leases. But when I put this property on the market, certainly these tenants are still there. And how am I going to sell this property unless I figure out a way to resolve the tenancy? And one way to resolve the tenancy would be to sell the unit to a buyer who's going to do an owner move-in. It's called the OMI. If the buyer is going to do an OMI, buyer has to pay 4 people relocation cost. And it's a little bit over $5,000 per person. There is a per household maximum. I don't remember what that amount is. If they are there with your permission, they become a tenant. Okay? The owner doesn't know, then it's not approved. Okay? But anyway, I'm just telling you that the definition of tenants is very broad. Okay? Providing disclosure to tenants. The above reference disclosure law does not say how the disclosure is to be provided to tenants. While any method of delivery would appear to be sufficient to comply with the law, delivery by a method resulting in proof of delivery or receipt is strongly recommended. Example, FedEx. So if you need to give notice to a tenant, such as, for example, you need to give the notice to the tenant that you're doing a OMI eviction, it is better that you do not use ordinary U.S. mail. If I were you, I'd use like FedEx or mails that can prove delivery, okay? If you use regular mail, the risk is that they're going to say, well, we never received it. So it's more problematic, okay? Now, even this statement here, but of course, this is to be given to the buyer and the sellers, okay? So you just provide this to the buyer and the seller and make them sign, okay? But just remember, all notices that you send to the tenant, better to do like FedEx, you can track it, something that you can track. Either you do it by FedEx, or if you send a messenger, but if you send a messenger, that messenger may have to testify in court if this messenger is not a licensed process server. If you use a relative to serve the notice, that relative may have to go to trial with you when there's a trial. Okay, so be careful about who you send as a messenger. If you want to send as a messenger, pay $100 to hire a professional licensed process server to do it for you, because if it's a proof of service signed by a licensed process server, he or she doesn't have to testify as a witness. But if it's not a licensed process server, that person who served the delivery, who made the delivery, has to testify as a witness. It's something that you should know. Okay. Tenants' rights and disclosures required by seller before selling and buyers after buying. Let's see here. Basically, this is advising the buyer that even if you become the owner, if it's a rent control property, you can't simply evict the tenant, because there are limited ways to evict a tenant, and one of the ways is to do an owner move in. But if you're an investor, you cannot get rid of the tenant unless the tenant doesn't pay rent. Okay? Also, there's one other thing though. If you are a buyer buying a rent control property, there are a couple of things that you have to be aware of. One of them has to do with parking. You cannot take away any previously agreed upon parking right that the previous landlord has given to this tenant. In other words, you cannot change the terms of the tenancy materially. You cannot raise the rent the way you want it. You cannot change the parking situation the way you want it. Okay? Before you change the parking situation, you better check with the rent board. If the rent board consider it to be material or immaterial, if the change is immaterial, they would allow you to do it. If the change is material, they will not allow you to do it. For example, if the tenants used to have 2 parking spaces, you cannot take away one of the parking spaces and give it to someone else. That will be a material change. Now, if you just want to change the parking spot, and the parking spot is not too far away from where the tenant used to park, maybe it's not material. But if you're changing the parking spot, either to a location that is much further away from where he used to park, or a smaller parking space, that could be a material change. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Okay. It says here, any tenants, subtenants, or roommates who were lawful occupants at the time of the sale remain lawful occupants. So if somebody that was previously approved by the seller, who is the previous landlord, to be there, even if this person is not on the lease, you have to allow that person to continue to remain there. Okay, something for your buyer to be aware of. Okay, if they can prove it. And then also when you take over a rent control unit, you cannot change certain housing services such as laundry. You know, you can't take away the laundry room. You cannot take away the storage space, because that will be a material change. All right? You cannot take away access to the laundry room. You cannot say, well, you cannot do laundry within your unit now, things like that. Okay? All right, that's it about this particular advisory form. Now, this form here is to be given with the last form that we talked about, about 15 minutes ago. These 2 forms, the general information statement about tenants' rights disclosure, as well as the San Francisco disclosure and advisory disclaimer advisory. Both forms will have to be provided to the seller as well as the buyer. Okay, these are standard disclosure and advisory form in the San Francisco area. Okay, there are actually a few more forms that will be covered in the future, but that's it for today. Okay, thank you guys.